Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Delegate David Reid with us today. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Woody. Thank you for having me today.
It's a cold and blustery day outside, but I know you're busy inside here. This is Lobby Day and also Martin Luther King Day, so there are a lot of people around in the corridors.
It is. It's a very busy day. I actually started at 7 a.m. this morning with my first bill defense, which was related to college affordability. That's been one of the things that's been really important to me because I'm the first person in my family ever to get a college degree. And when I say that, I mean ever, because I've been able to trace my family's roots to Rockbridge County in Virginia back to the 1700s, and I'm the first person ever to get a college degree. So making sure that college remains affordable is something that's really very important to me.
Talk to us about your schedule. I mean, 7 a.m., I don't think people understand, but that was probably a subcommittee meeting, was it not?
It was a subcommittee meeting, and that's one of those things. People will ask me, they go, were you surprised by anything going down to the General Assembly? And I was not surprised by the workload because I've always worked hard at everything I've done in my life, and I had the great fortune of being able to talk to a lot of existing delegates who would kind of explain to me what the schedule was going to be like that. So I knew that, and I'm an early riser anyway, so getting up and then being able to get here for a 7 o'clock subcommittee meeting is perfectly fine. Now, subcommittee and committee meetings will run until about 11 o'clock, and then at 11 o'clock we will have a caucus meeting, and 12 o'clock on the spot we go into session. And I will tell people that going into session can depend on how long, and it depends on where we are in the session. So we can start at 12 o'clock, and if there aren't a lot of bills who've made it through the committees and subcommittees to be considered, then we might get out very shortly. But also last year, as we got towards crossover, we were there till 7, 8 o'clock at night. So it can really vary. Now, right now, the point we're at, we'll wrap up, maybe probably about 2 o'clock, and then I have another bill that I have to defend before, I believe it is a full committee in the afternoon. So the process kind of repeats itself in the morning and then in the afternoon.
So why is subcommittee important?
The subcommittees and the committees are really more the subcommittees are where all the work gets done, because those are small settings. I believe that we have either, I think it's 8 or so on the committee. And so there are 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats. I think that's usually the numbers that are kind of divided up. But that's where the real work happens. You're really, no kidding, sitting around a small table with your peers and people who are subject matter experts who are coming in to be able to talk about these things, and that's where you can actually go, this would be a really good idea if we changed this, or if you did this amendment, or you did different things. And quite honestly, Chairman Ingram of CCT Committee has really made an effort to delegate all of the responsibilities down to the subcommittees, so when things get to the full CCT Committee, there's very little to do because it's all been worked out in the subcommittees.
So that's county, cities, and towns,
yes.
And that's Riley Ingram who's the chair of that.
Yes, that's correct. And I feel really fortunate because when I got elected last year, I put in a request for some different committees, and I feel really fortunate that I was able to get on transportation, because transportation is very important to Northern Virginia and specifically to the 32nd District, and also county, cities, and towns. Because again, I represent an area that is one of the fastest growing areas in the state. So I thought those two really kind of dovetailed well with things that were of interest to me and of interest to the community that I represent.
Well, let's talk about that area you represent. It's primarily Loudoun County, is it not?
That's correct. Yeah, I am one of the few, I think there might be 5 or 6 of us delegates who represent a single jurisdiction within the district that we represent. So the 32nd District is all within the eastern portion of Loudoun County. Now the interesting thing is that when these districts were drawn in 2011, if you remember, the state of Virginia had about 8 million people, so divide that by about 100 and you get about 80,000 in each one of the districts. Because I am in one of the fastest growing areas in the state, I now represent either the most populous or the second most populous district there, according to the realtors, and I think they probably know who's coming and going into the community. There's now about 95,000 residents in the district that I represent.
Do you have many federal workers who are impacted by the shutdown?
There are a large number of federal workers as well as contractors, including myself. I work as a defense contractor, and there are a large number there, and a fair number of them have unfortunately been adversely affected by the shutdown that's currently going on. And there's a real important distinction that occurs here in that if you are a federal worker, when you go back to work, historically Congress has approved that you will get back pay. Now, that doesn't happen for contractors. And there's a contractor that I know who, in the shutdown, I think it was in 2013, he said, I'm done with this. I mean, because he tried to cover salaries for a small company of about 30 people for, I think we were out maybe 17 days that time, and it almost bankrupted his company. And so those are the unintended consequences that a lot of people, especially the folks in the federal government, don't see, because those contractors will never get made whole again with that money.
And there are some contractors, for example, who employ people who work in federal buildings who may clean up after folks are gone.
It's a full gamut of things. I mean, it's whether it's janitorial services, it can be maintenance around the facility. Again, the folks that I work for, we actually provide contracting support to the Department of Defense, and it is in high-end information technology, systems engineering, those type of things. So it can be the full spectrum of work that's being done, because the federal government has decided that it is much easier to be able to contract out for these specialties, and then if they decide that they need to change or redirect where they're spending their money, it's much easier to be able to have contractors, for them to not exercise an option year or a task order and then shift their funding someplace else.
Impact of Amazon, the announcement about its co-headquarters in Northern Virginia.
So, of course, there's a portion of Loudoun County and Fairfax County that was kind of in the running for it, and it's great that it's coming to Crystal City, and it is, I think, the biggest economic win for Virginia or for the country in recent memory. So it is a big deal. One of the things that I had highlighted when the award had occurred is I'm very grateful for it, very glad that they're coming, but I wanted to be sure that the implementation of the Virginia Tech campus down there was not going to result in additional tuition increases for people who are my constituents. So that was one thing. The other thing is that with the fact that we're doing this new construction and we're doing this whole new area, we have a real opportunity to be able to make this a showcase for walkable space, renewable energy, all of those type of things. And so I had contacted the governor's office after the announcement a day or two later and said, these are a couple of things that as we get towards the implementation phase, that I would really like for you to be sure that we take a serious look at.
And of course, affordable housing is part of that equation as well.
It is. Affordable housing is really very important, both in Alexandria, Arlington, as well as in the Ashburn and Loudoun area. One of the things that I like to talk about is that all of these things generally are kind of like an equation, whether it's chemistry or physics or algebra or any type of thing. So part of the affordable housing thing is we have to have enough units on the market so that there's sufficient ones there that can be made available to people. The other thing is that we have to do a much better job of paying our teachers, our firefighters, and our police officers so that they can live in the community where they work. If you think back probably to a time when I was growing up, or perhaps you as well, that you would have the police officer who lived down the street, or the firefighter, or you would have the teacher who lived down the street, so that they became role models for the community. Now, unfortunately, they can't afford to live where they're actually working, and so at least for my area, they end up living out in Winchester, or they live in West Virginia, or someplace else like that. So there's two sides to that equation. We got to be sure that we're paying them well enough to be able to live in the community where they work, but we also have to make sure that there is a sufficient inventory of affordable dwellings that they can then actually afford as well.
And of course, part of the governor's budget message includes pay raise for state employees and for teachers.
It does, and that moves us in the right direction. So if you remember, last year we approved as part of the budget a 3% increase for teachers, and he's adding now another 2%, which would be a 5% increase, which is really long overdue, and it moves us in the right direction, and that's something that we really need to be sure that we're focusing on, not just for this budget year, but also in future budget years.
Now, localities have some responsibility in terms of teacher pay raises, do they not?
They do, the localities, because the state is not providing the funding to pay for the increases for every teacher and for all of the positions. So the localities do have to be on board as well.
Let's go back and talk a little bit about college affordability,
okay.
Because that's something you mentioned earlier and you have legislation on. And you're the first person in your family to go to college, so you're very conversant with the cost of college education, which has just skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that? What does your legislation do?
So what my legislation does, there's two things. One is, last year we passed a piece of legislation which created something that was called the Student Loan Ombudsman. And that was to basically create an office at the state level that would be able to consolidate information for people who are dealing with their student loans to figure out how they could deal with those, how they could consolidate them, what they could do as far as being able to repay those. So that addresses the issue after it has occurred. What I'm trying to do this year is address the issue before it occurs, and that's being done in two different ways. One is it's something that's called the Financial Aid Shopping Sheet, and what it does is it uses some information from Chev that says, okay, there's going to be a standard format that when you get your financial award letter, you know how much is a loan and you know how much is a grant, how much you have to pay back and how much you don't have to. Because right now, award letters could be ambiguous. And so therefore, you get this and you go, oh wow, I got $10,000 award, but maybe $7,500 of it is in a loan. And you may not know that until later when you are signing the promissory note and now you've already committed to the school. So it's about providing the student and the family with more information up front. The other thing is that if you take the system as a whole, in 2017, tuition increases across the entire system for Virginia was about 4.8%. And the consumer price index was only about 2.1%. So this is about a 100% increase over the CPI. So what my other piece of legislation, which is the College Affordability Act is what I'm calling it, will actually say, if you're a university that has been doing a good job over the last 10 years of keeping your cost and your tuition increases in check, then you'll be able to still do tuition increases as long as they don't exceed CPI. If, however, you have been one of those universities, and there's a local university here in Richmond who increased their tuition last year by 6.4%, so 300% more than CPI. If you're one of those universities, then you're going to be restricted. You're going to be capped in how much you can increase your tuition, or prohibited from increasing it at all until you've been able to have a run of getting your cost under control.
What about community colleges? How are they doing in terms of tuition increases?
For the most part, community colleges are still a really very good deal. I mean, they really are. And one of the things that I talk about is that, again, when I was going through college, when I was going through high school and then going into college, it was almost a given that you had to go get a 4-year degree to be successful at all. Times have changed now. You can go to a 2-year community college and you can get some type of certification or an associate's degree and then go out and make really good money. You can go to a union apprenticeship program and get paid for while you're actually getting trained to be an electrical engineer or an electrician and still get good money and come out with no debt, and if that's something that you like doing. You have different options that you have, certifications in cybersecurity, those type of things. There are options now that are available that weren't available when, say, myself or you might have been looking at going to college. And we have to be sure that at the 9th grade level, we're making those options available and known to 9th graders, that your path to success doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to the most expensive 4-year university, but instead you can still make a good living if you're doing something different and you're choosing to get your advanced education through a different way.
At the 9th grade level, are there any opportunities for dual enrollment, for example, at a community college?
I know that there are at Northern Virginia Community College, and I'm not sure whether or not it starts at the 9th grade level or if it starts at the junior or senior level, but it is. And the Northern Virginia Community College has done a really good job of making sure that they're offering those dual enrollments without any additional cost to the students.
So the affordability at the institutions of higher learning also will act as an element to feed the Amazons of the world, so to speak. Oh,
yeah. I mean, all of these things, whether it's Micron or Amazon or Capital One, or I talk to so many businesses in my community, and they say that they have so many open jobs that I think in the state of Virginia as a whole, I think the number might be 30,000 cybersecurity open positions. And those are positions that may or may not require a 4-year degree. Maybe it's a 2-year degree, maybe it's some type of industry certification. And all of those things feed in. And then a lot of companies, it's like if you can go to work for a Capital One or an Amazon or something like that, they then have tuition assistance programs. You can then work on getting your degree or your advanced degree later and do it over a longer period of time, but still get a degree, still be successful, and not be saddled with a lot of student debt.
And of course, there's a way to gain admittance to an institution of higher learning by having a certain grade point average at the community college level.
Mm-hmm, very much so. And again, I know more specifically in the Northern Virginia area, Northern Virginia Community College has done a really great job of working with George Mason University, and I think it's something that they call Partnership for Success or something along those lines, where they've worked together so that they can actually define for the community college student what they need to be doing as they then go from the 2-year to the 4-year program.
What about job opportunities in the healthcare industry?
Again, a really big area in Northern Virginia. George Washington University School for Science and Technology is in the district that I represent, and I have been there 3 times now, and they have one of the top nursing programs, I believe, in the state of Virginia, and they are doing some phenomenal work. It's really amazing to see the kind of live action mannequins that they have that the nurses can work with. And I asked them, I said, so what did nurses do before? And before, I think nurses would do a lot of kind of practical stuff and then get put into an environment with actual patients. And so the nurses, I believe, coming out of these schools now are so much better prepared because they have much better learning tools now.
Now, your district is a fairly wealthy one compared to others. What about Medicaid expansion? How important will that be?
So I can't remember the number specifically, but you're right. I do represent an area that is much more affluent than other areas of the state. But one of the things that I like to talk about when people ask me what are your lessons learned from having gone down to your first session and now your second session, I will tell them 4 things, and I will get to your question about this. One is you must be able to do basic math. 51 is still greater than 49, and everything else flows downhill from that.
And it's 48 now.
Yes. The other thing is that you need to transition from campaigning to governing. There are things that you talk about on the campaign trail. Now you've got to try to put that into legislation, like what I've talked about. The third thing is, much like anything, you have to be able to develop relationships. And the fourth thing is you've got to be empathetic. And I think because I grew up poor in the mountains of Rockbridge County, Virginia, and then I went and I lived at the children's home in Richmond, Virginia, and then as a naval intel officer, I did duty down in the Hampton Roads area, and now I've lived in Alexandria and in Loudoun County. I have a much broader view of the issues that affect the entire state. So when Delegate Bourne says to me something that needs to be addressed about Richmond Public Schools, I understand it, I get it, because I went to those public schools. When someone talks about needing to have jobs down in Appalachia or Southwest, it's like my dad made $3,000 a year trying to support 4 children before we went to the children's home. So again, I get it. And I try to take that view with the fact that, yeah, I live in an area that we have transportation issues, we have issues with college affordability, but I also recognize that I've got to be empathetic to the other concerns across the state so that I can then hopefully expect my other fellow delegates to be empathetic with the concerns that we have in Northern Virginia.
And I'm sure you're empathetic in terms of a report that came out recently regarding foster care and the deficiencies there.
Yeah, very, very much so, because I went and lived at the children's home for 6 years, and then I was adopted by my foster parents and then moved out to Oklahoma. And one of the pieces of legislation that I have this year is something that's called the Post-Adoption Contact and Communication Agreement, so PACA for short. And my dad and my foster parents knew each other, had a good relationship. I still am very much in contact with my foster parents. They have become foster grandparents to my children. And so I have this extended family that stretches into DC and Mississippi and all kinds of other places through my foster parents. But in 78, when that was being done, it was a different time. And I still have a great relationship with my dad as well, who's now 94, or will turn 95, I think, in February. And so what the PACA arrangement would do would be to at least notify birth parents and adoptive parents that there is the ability to enter into a voluntary agreement so that they can establish what the parameters are going to be for how they communicate and how they stay in contact with each other as they move through the child's life. It worked out fantastic for me, but there was no agreement in place. But we also have to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes children are taken from their parents because of abusive situations, and we need to be very protective of the children in that aspect as well.
Yeah, one of the frustrations I've run into, because I've done some work for CASA in the past, was when kids started aging out and there were no programs or support for them. How do you deal with that issue?
That is something that we really do have to address. And in kind of how things come full circle, because I spent 6 years at the Methodist Children's Home, they've now invited me back to be a member of the board. So I'm on the board of directors now, and this is one of the things that I bring up on a regular basis, and they're very much in tune to it, and they're trying to do things. And I know that there are other organizations that I've met with, because I started sharing the story about my upbringing and everything because people wanted to know who I was and who they were electing and where my values came from. One of the big surprises for me was the fact that it got kind of statewide traction and became something that allowed me to be able to speak out more about what we need to be doing, because I have peers who were with me at the children's home who then aged out and went back to the same areas where they had come from and kind of then continued to live the life that their parents had lived. And we have to, I had the opportunity because my foster parents took me to Oklahoma, and I was the first person to be able to go to college, and that college degree allowed me to break that cycle of poverty that my family had lived in for generations. And we've got to be sure that we give those other foster children and adopted children who are aging out, we've got to be sure that we give them that same opportunity.
Let's change the subject to electric utilities, because you
Okay.
have some legislation dealing with fossil fuels and plants that generate and burn coal, for example.
Yeah, this piece of legislation, which we're referring to as the Renewables First Act, is such a great representation of what it means to be a citizen legislator and then be able to rely on the citizens themselves to be the subject matter experts to help get you the information that you need to be able to write good legislation. After the end of last session, I met with a group of about 30 individuals in their house, and we're talking about scientists, engineers, environmentalists, concerned citizens, a great group of people. And we talked about what was the art of possible, what could we actually achieve? Because there are aspirational goals of where we all want to be with 100% renewable energy, and we want to go 100% green. And the reality of it is that we also all want a first world economy. We want the lights to come on when you cut it on, when you cut the switch on. You want your house to be warm in the winter and cool during the winter. So we all want those things. So how do we incrementally move ourselves forward? And that's what we've come up with. And what this does is this borrows upon the Grid Transformation and Security Act that was passed last year that said that 5,500 megawatts is in the public interest. What this bill does is it provides more prescriptive definition that says to the State Corporation Commission, before you approve any new fossil fuels, you first must approve and bring online 5,500 megawatts of renewable energy. So it basically takes what we did last year and makes it provides more definition about what we want to achieve going forward. It still allows for the fact that fossil fuel plants might be necessary to bring online, but it actually puts the renewable energy at the front of the queue.
You're a veteran, and
yes.
You probably have a number of veterans in your district, and I know you have some legislation dealing with veterans.
Yeah. So I got in the Navy Reserves in 1988 and stayed until 2011, so 23 years. And it was a fantastic experience. I got opportunities to go to Korea twice, Iceland once. I got to drill out, I got to deploy outside with the Army, which is not necessarily as much fun as you would think, considering I was a Navy officer, so it was a little bit different environment. But yeah, I mean, it gave me such understanding and leadership and different things. I mean, it was just such a fantastic experience. So I would encourage anyone to kind of pursue that. But I have two pieces of legislation this year that relates to military specifically. One is the state active duty pay. So what you may not realize is that when we recall someone to help with the snowstorm that we just recently had, they end up having to report for duty within like 12 to 18 hours. And if you're an E1 through an E5, you don't get paid very much at all for that particular deployment. So what this does is it basically creates a state baseline that says that they will be paid the equivalent of an E6 with 18 years of pay, which is not a lot because they're being taken away from their family on short notice, and they're going out there to help us with snows, hurricanes, different things. Doesn't apply if they get recalled to federal duty, because if they get recalled to federal duty, then they will get their federal pay, they'll get their basic allowance for quarters, their basic allowance for housing, they'll probably get hazardous duty pay. So the pay from the federal side is always much more substantial than if you just get recalled for state active duty pay. The second piece of legislation is a piece of legislation that if you are rated as being 60% service disabled or more, then you will get an additional 96 hours of sick leave if you're a state employee, so that you can actually use that 96 hours of sick leave to go and address, get evaluated, get treatment for your actual disability.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, Delegate David Reid. Good luck the rest of the session.
Thank you very much, Woody, for having me. It's fantastic.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.